The door opened at 8:30 on a Thursday, and Helena Zhao realized she had agreed to translate ancient Hungarian marriage contracts for a man who looked like winter had carved him from marble and decided to let him walk. Miss Zhao. His voice matched his appearance, low, aristocratic, faintly accented in a way her ear couldn't place despite fluency in 7 languages. I appreciate you meeting me at such short notice. The usual translator at the consulate became unavailable. She stepped aside to let him into her apartment's small foyer, immediately regretting that she hadn't changed out of her paint-splattered sweater. The building's fluorescent hallway light caught his hair white blonde, almost silver, pulled back in a style that belonged in a different century. His skin held the same pale luminosity, and his eyes were dark enough to seem black in the dim entryway. The agency said it was urgent, Helena said, closing the door and leading him toward her office nook. Something about a diplomatic summit next month? A gathering of old families, he said, following her with movements that were too smooth, too deliberate. Very old. The contracts date to 1487. Your reputation for medieval Hungarian dialects preceded you. Professor Markov spoke quite highly of your work on the Corvinus manuscripts. Helena felt a flush of pride despite herself. The Corvinus project had taken 3 years and nearly destroyed her eyesight. Those were fascinating. Diplomatic marriage contracts between noble houses, Byzantine influence on the language structure. She pulled out her desk chair and gestured for him to take the armchair she kept for clients. Is this similar material? He settled into the chair with unnerving grace, producing a leather portfolio that looked genuinely antique. Remarkably similar. We have several such contracts that require modern interpretation. The families involved are quite particular about accuracy. We? Helena sat, pulling her laptop closer and switching on her recording equipment. I didn't catch your name or which consulate you're representing. Forgive me. He inclined his head in a gesture that was somehow both apologetic and regal. Phelan Jovanović. I represent a collection of Central European interests. Old nobility, mostly ceremonial these days, but the contracts still hold legal weight in certain contexts. Helena had worked with enough eccentric clients to simply nod and make a note. European nobility could be stranger than fiction when it came to preserving ancient traditions. All right, Mr. Jovanović, let's see what we're working with. The contracts were extraordinary, not copies but originals. The vellum still supple despite its age, the ink only slightly faded. Helena felt her pulse quicken the way it always did when confronted with genuine historical treasure. The language was indeed medieval Hungarian with Latin influences, but there were phrases she had never encountered, terminology that seemed to reference traditions she couldn't identify. This word here, she said, pointing to a repeated phrase in the 3rd clause. It's not standard medieval Hungarian. It looks like it might be borrowing from Old Church Slavonic, but the context suggests something more specific than just bloodline. Do you have any background materials on the cultural practices involved? Phelan leaned forward, close enough that she caught his scent, something like cold stone and old books and winter nights. The families in question had very particular beliefs about lineage and inheritance. Blood bonds were taken quite literally. A marriage wasn't just a political alliance, but a merging of literal bloodlines, with ceremonies to mark the union. Fascinating. Helena made rapid notes, her mind already working through possible translations. So this would be closer to blood covenant than simple lineage. That changes the entire legal implication of the clause. It's not just about inheritance rights, but about creating an irrevocable bond between families. Precisely. Something in his voice made her look up, and she found him watching her with an intensity that should have been unsettling, but instead felt oddly warm. You understand quickly. That will be invaluable. They worked for 2 hours, Helena growing more absorbed in the linguistic puzzles, while Phelan provided cultural context that seemed impossibly detailed for someone representing ceremonial interests. He spoke about the families involved with intimate knowledge, their feuds, their alliances, the precise social dynamics that had necessitated each contract. You talk about them like you knew them personally, Helena said at one point, flexing her cramped fingers. Family histories, he said smoothly, passed down through generations. When you're responsible for preserving these traditions, the stories become quite vivid. It was nearly 11 when Helena finally sat back, rubbing her eyes. I can do this, but it's going to take time. There are at least 40 distinct documents here, and each one requires careful analysis to capture the legal nuances. I'd estimate 3 weeks for a complete translation with annotations. The summit is in 4 weeks, Phelan said. Would it help if I made myself available for consultation? There will be questions only someone familiar with the families can answer. That would actually be incredibly helpful, Helena admitted. Some of this terminology is so specific, I'm basically reconstructing an entire cultural vocabulary. Having you on call would cut my research time in half. He smiled, then the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face from marble sculpture to something startlingly alive. Then I'm at your disposal, Miss Zhao. Shall we say the same time tomorrow evening? Helena walked him to the door, already mentally reorganizing her schedule. This project was too interesting to pass up, even if it meant long nights. At the threshold, Phelan paused, turning back to her. Thank you for taking this on, he said quietly. These contracts matter more than you might realize. The wrong interpretation could have significant consequences. I'll be careful, she promised. Historical accuracy is kind of my obsession. I'm beginning to see that. His dark eyes held hers for a moment longer. Until tomorrow evening, then. She closed the door after him and leaned against it, feeling oddly breathless. Professional interest, she told herself firmly. The project was fascinating and the client was knowledgeable. The fact that he looked like some pre-Raphaelite painting come to life was utterly irrelevant. She didn't sleep well that night, her dreams full of medieval ceremonies and blood oaths and dark eyes watching her with ancient patience. Phelan returned the next evening precisely at 8:30, this time carrying a leather bag that proved to contain more documents and a bottle of wine that looked older than her apartment building. I thought we might need sustenance, he said, setting the bottle on her kitchen counter. A Takagi from 1921. It pairs well with intensive translation work. Helena laughed despite herself. Do you always bring century-old wine to business meetings? Only when the work matters. He shrugged out of his long coat, revealing a black shirt that somehow managed to look both modern and timelessly elegant. And when the company is worth impressing. It was such a blatant piece of flattery that Helena should have rolled her eyes, but the way he said it straightforward, almost matter-of-fact, made it feel sincere rather than performative. Well, you've succeeded. I've never had wine older than my parents. They settled into a rhythm over the following evenings. Helena would work through sections of the contracts and Phelan would provide context that grew increasingly detailed and impossibly specific. He spoke about the families with the kind of knowledge that came from lived experience rather than historical record, the personality quirks of long-dead nobles, the secret motivations behind political marriages, the precise emotional tenor of centuries-old feuds. You know, you sound like you were actually there sometimes, Helena said on the fourth evening after Phelan had delivered a particularly vivid description of a 1523 wedding feast. He went very still for a heartbeat too long. Then he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I have an overactive imagination. Family stories become quite real when you've heard them repeated for generations. Helena decided not to push, though the historian in her noted the deflection. Instead, she poured them both more wine, not the Takagi, which had been extraordinary, but a more modest bottle she'd contributed, and steered the conversation to the linguistic structures she was finding. The thing that's striking me, she said, is how these contracts emphasize consent and choice. I expected medieval marriage contracts to be purely transactional, but there are clauses here that specifically require both parties to verbally affirm the bond. It's surprisingly progressive for the era. The families involved believed that bonds formed under coercion were weak, Phelan said. True loyalty, true alliance had to be chosen freely. Otherwise, it was just chains, and chains can always be broken. Is that what the current summit is about? Helena asked. Creating new alliances? Something like that. Phelan's expression grew distant. The families have maintained an uneasy peace for a very long time, but there are those who would prefer different arrangements. The summit is meant to formalize agreements that will prevent conflict. And one of those agreements involves you? His gaze snapped back to her, sharp and searching. What makes you say that? Helena gestured to the documents spread across her desk. Because 3 of these contracts are templates, not historical records. They're drafted for future use, and one of them has your family name in the primary position. You're not just translating history, are you? You're preparing for your own marriage contract. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Phelan stood, moving to her window to look out at the city lights. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. The peace between the families requires certain sacrifices. I am expected to formalize an alliance with the House of Draculishti through marriage. It's a political necessity. But you don't want to. It wasn't a question. What I want is irrelevant. He turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his expression. I am the vampire king, Miss Zhao. I have maintained the peace between our courts for 3 centuries. If my marriage to the Draculeshti heir prevents another war, then it's a small price to pay. The words hung in the air. Vampire King and Helena's brain stuttered over them, even as everything else suddenly clicked into terrible, perfect sense. The pale skin and white hair. The impossible knowledge of historical events. The way he'd never touched the food she'd offered, only ever the wine. The fact that all their meetings happened after dark. You're serious, she said slowly. You're actually telling me you're a vampire. I'm telling you the truth you'd already begun to suspect. Phelan's expression was unreadable. The families I represent aren't ceremonial nobility. We're the vampire courts of Central and Eastern Europe, 7 houses that have existed for millennia, sometimes in alliance, often at war. I've held the position of High King for 317 years, maintaining a balance that has kept our world hidden and relatively peaceful. Helena's hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her desk, forcing herself to breathe slowly and think. The contracts, they're not about human marriages at all. No, they're about vampire alliances, blood bonds that tie houses together, prevent direct aggression, create structures of mutual obligation. The summit will formalize a new generation of such bonds. My marriage to Seraphine of House Draculeshti will unite the 2 most powerful courts and effectively guarantee peace for at least another century. And if you don't marry her, then House Draculeshti will likely consider it an insult and withdraw from the accords. 2 other houses will see it as weakness and attempt to seize power. We'll descend into factional war that will cost thousands of vampire lives and risk exposure to the human world. He said it flatly, like reciting a weather report. So you see, what I want is very much beside the point. Helena stood moving closer to him, studying his face in the lamplight. Up close, she could see the slight iridescence to his skin, the way his pupils reflected light like a cat's. And what do you want? That's an unfair question. Answer it anyway. Phelan looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a crack in the careful control. I want to keep standing in doorways talking about medieval linguistics with a brilliant translator who argues with me about verb conjugations. I want to bring you more ridiculous wine and watch you get excited about manuscript preservation techniques. I want more evenings that don't involve the weight of centuries and the demands of courts and the endless political calculations that come with this crown I never asked for. The honesty of it hit Helena in the chest. She'd spent 2 weeks watching him relax incrementally in her presence, the formal diplomat giving way to someone curious and engaged and surprisingly funny. She'd found herself looking forward to 8:30 with an eagerness that had nothing to do with the fascinating contracts. You never asked for it, she said quietly. I was a scholar once, Phelan said. A translator myself, actually, working on Greek and Arabic texts in Constantinople. I was turned during a siege, and the vampire who turned me was an ancient king who'd grown tired of rule. He passed the crown to me with his blood and died in the sunlight the next morning. I've been trapped in this position ever since, trying to prevent the chaos that would come if I abdicated. 300 years of keeping the peace, Helena said. That's not nothing, Phelan. It's not everything either. He reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. I should go. You know what I am now, and I've put you in a difficult position. If you want to withdraw from the project, I'll understand and ensure you're compensated for your time. Is any of it real? Helena asked. These evenings, the conversations, are you just using me to translate the contracts? It's the most real thing I've experienced in decades, Phelan said simply. Which is precisely why I should go. He was turning toward the door when Helena made a decision that was probably insane but felt utterly necessary. She caught his sleeve, stopping him. Don't. Yes, you should probably go because it's nearly 1 a.m. and I have a lecture to give tomorrow, but don't withdraw the project. I want to finish this. Helena, I'm not afraid of you, she interrupted. I should probably be terrified, and maybe I will be tomorrow when I've processed this properly, but right now I want to keep working with you. Is that stupid? It might be the kindest thing anyone's offered me in a century, Phelan said quietly, but I have to marry Seraphine in 4 weeks. This can't go anywhere. Then it doesn't go anywhere, Helena said with more confidence than she felt. We work together, you get your translations, I get to handle genuinely unique historical documents, and in 4 weeks you go to your summit and do what you have to do. We're both adults. We can manage a professional relationship. Phelan's expression suggested he thought this was a terrible idea, but he nodded slowly. If you're certain. I'm certain. Helena released his sleeve, stepping back to a more professional distance. Same time tomorrow? Tomorrow, he agreed, and left before she could second-guess herself. Helena spent the next day in a daze, half convinced she'd hallucinated the entire conversation. But the contracts were still on her desk, and when she examined them with new understanding, the references to blood bonds and eternal alliances took on layers she'd missed before. These weren't metaphors, they were literal descriptions of vampire magic. Phelan arrived that evening with more documents and a carefully neutral expression. They worked in silence for nearly an hour before Helena finally set down her pen. I have questions, she said. Can I ask them? Or is this all classified vampire business? You're already so deep in classified vampire business that a few more answers won't hurt, Phelan said. Ask. Sunlight. Is it actually lethal? Yes, complete cellular breakdown within minutes of direct exposure. Older vampires can tolerate indirect light shade, heavy cloud cover for brief periods, but direct sunlight is universally fatal. Blood. Do you have to kill people? No. We need to feed regularly, but a skilled vampire can take blood without causing significant harm or leaving lasting memories. Most of us have established arrangements with willing donors. He paused. I haven't killed a human for food in over 200 years, if that's what you're asking. It was part of it. Helena twisted her pen between her fingers. The marriage to Seraphine, is it just political, or will you be expected to actually, be together? Vampire marriages can be whatever the bonded parties make them, Phelan said carefully. Many are political arrangements where both parties maintain separate lives. Some develop into genuine partnerships. I barely know Seraphine. We've met formally perhaps 3 times. I imagine we'll negotiate terms that allow us both privacy. But you'll be bound to her, literally, according to these contracts. The blood bond creates a connection that prevents direct harm between bonded vampires and their houses. It's not a romantic bond, just a magical one. I'll be able to feel if she's in mortal danger, and she'll feel the same for me. It's meant to prevent assassination and betrayal. Helena absorbed this, trying to square it with the modern world she thought she understood. How many people know vampires exist? Fewer than you'd think. A handful of government officials in various countries, some old families who've served vampire courts for generations, occasional individuals who stumble into our world and prove trustworthy enough to leave alive. He gave her a wry look. You're now in that last category. Congratulations. Lucky me. But she smiled despite herself. Are there other supernatural things I should know about? Werewolves, witches. Werewolves are extinct, wiped out in a war 3 centuries ago that I'd rather not discuss. Witches exist, but are rare humans born with the ability to manipulate certain natural forces. Most stay far away from vampire politics. We have an understanding. They fell back into work after that, but the atmosphere had shifted. Helena felt like she was seeing the documents with new eyes, understanding the weight of what she was translating. These weren't just historical curiosities, they were living legal frameworks that governed an entire hidden civilization. The evenings continued, each one bleeding later into the night. Phelan proved to be easy company once the initial strangeness wore off. He was wickedly smart, with a dry sense of humor that caught Helena off guard. He'd bring her coffee, he couldn't drink it himself, but he'd learned her preferred order from the cafe down the street, and they'd argue cheerfully about interpretive choices and historical context. You're wrong about the suffix, Helena said on the 10th evening, pointing at a disputed phrase. It's not indicating possession, but rather obligation. The structure parallels this earlier clause, see? It's creating a requirement, not a transfer of property. I've read this contract a dozen times over the past century and always interpreted it as possession, Phelan said, leaning over her shoulder to examine her notes. But you're right. The parallel structure makes it clear. That changes the entire nature of the agreement. It's not about owning territory, but about responsibility for protecting it. Which makes much more sense given the historical context. Helena said triumphantly, I told you linguistic analysis beats institutional memory. Your institutional memory is considerably shorter than mine, Phelan pointed out, but he was smiling. Though I'm beginning to think your decade of study might outweigh my 3 centuries of casual familiarity. He was close enough that Helena could feel the coolness radiating from his skin, not quite cold, but noticeably below human body temperature. She'd grown used to it, the way she'd grown used to the slight luminescence of his eyes in dim light, and the preternatural stillness that overtook him when he was thinking. Can I ask you something personal? She said, not moving away. You can ask. Do you actually want to be king? Not just as an obligation, but if you could choose freely, would you want this role? Phelan was quiet for a long moment. I don't know anymore. It's been so long since I had the luxury of wanting anything beyond survival and stability. The crown is what I am, what I've been for longer than I was anything else. I was human for 28 years and a vampire king for 317. Sometimes I can barely remember the scholar I was before. He's still in there, Helena said softly. I see him every time you get excited about a linguistic detail or bring me some obscure reference text you thought I'd find interesting. Perhaps? Phelan straightened, putting careful distance between them. But he doesn't get to make the important decisions. The king does, and the king knows what's required. The summit loomed closer, and the translations progressed steadily. Helena had moved from the historical contracts to the modern templates, including the one that would bind Phelan to Seraphine. Reading it felt invasive, like watching someone write their own prison sentence, but she forced herself to remain professional. There's something odd in Clause 7, she said on the 15th evening. It references a provision for diplomatic intervention in the case of irreconcilable dispute, but the language is vague. What qualifies as irreconcilable? It's a safety valve, Phelan explained. If the bonded parties find themselves in a situation where the alliance is causing more harm than good, a council of neutral houses can mediate. In extreme cases, they can dissolve the bond, though it requires unanimous agreement and usually involves significant political penalty. Has it ever been invoked? Twice in the past millennium. Both times it prevented civil war, but cost the vampires involved considerable power and influence. It's not a light option. Helena made careful notes, her mind working through possibilities. The contracts she'd been translating were complex political instruments, but they weren't immutable. There were provisions for negotiation, for creative interpretation, for finding solutions that served the spirit of the agreements, even when the letter proved impossible. What if the summit didn't require your marriage? She asked suddenly. What if there was another way to guarantee the alliance with House Draculesti? Phelan looked at her sharply. Such as? I don't know yet, but these contracts are full of alternative provisions and secondary clauses. They're designed to be flexible because they were written by people who understood that rigid systems break. There has to be something we're missing, some other way to structure the peace that doesn't require you to marry someone you don't love. Helena. Entire councils of vampire scholars have reviewed these agreements. If there was another way, someone would have found it by now. Vampire scholars, Helena said, with centuries of institutional assumptions about how these things work. But I'm coming at this fresh, and I'm trained to look for linguistic nuances that might have been overlooked. Just give me a few more days with the foundational documents. Let me see if there's something there. The summit is in 9 days. Then I'd better work fast. She threw herself into the research with an intensity that worried even her. Phelan started arriving earlier and staying later, providing access to documents she hadn't seen before: original treaties, correspondence between houses, legal precedents from centuries of vampire governance. They worked side by side, Helena's desk buried under papers and Phelan's laptop displaying scanned manuscripts from private archives. Here, Helena said on the 18th evening, stabbing her finger at a passage in a treaty from 1612. This establishes the principle of substitute satisfaction. If a required obligation cannot be fulfilled as written, an alternative of equivalent value can be proposed and must be considered in good faith. That was invoked for territorial disputes, Phelan said, reading over her shoulder. One house couldn't cede a specific region because it had been destroyed in a fire, so they offered a different territory of similar strategic value. But the principle isn't limited to territorial disputes. Look at the language. It says, any required obligation. Marriage is an obligation under these treaties. If you can't fulfill the marriage obligation as specified, you should be able to propose an alternative of equivalent value. The equivalent value of a marriage alliance is another marriage alliance. Helena, there's no substitute that would satisfy House Draculeshti except my bond to Seraphine. What if there is? Helena pulled up another document, this one from the contracts she'd translated in the first week. This clause here, it specifies that the purpose of marriage alliances is to create irrevocable bonds between houses that ensure mutual protection and prevent betrayal. But there are other ways to create such bonds. Phelan went very still, reading the passage she'd indicated. You're thinking of a treaty bond. I'm thinking that if the goal is mutual protection and prevention of betrayal, a comprehensive treaty with enforcement mechanisms and neutral oversight might actually serve that purpose better than a marriage between two people who barely know each other, especially if the treaty included provisions that made betrayal more costly than the marriage bond would. It's never been done at this level, Phelan said slowly. Treaty bonds are used for minor houses, not for alliances between major powers. Because major powers have traditionally used marriage, but that's custom, not requirement. If you can present a treaty structure that genuinely serves the same protective function, the principle of substitute satisfaction says it must be considered in good faith. Phelan sat back, his expression somewhere between hope and disbelief. You'd have to draft it perfectly. Every house would scrutinize it for weaknesses. House Draculeshti would be looking for any excuse to reject it and claim insult. Then we draft it perfectly, Helena said. You know the political dynamics, and I know how to structure legally airtight language. We have 9 days. 8, Phelan corrected. I have to leave for the summit location the day before to handle preliminary negotiations. Then we better not sleep much. They didn't. Helena called in sick to her university job and cleared her schedule completely. Phelan brought in more resources legal advisors from his court who appeared after dark and worked with quiet efficiency. A vampire named Mikhail, who'd had been drafting treaties since the Byzantine Empire and proved invaluable for understanding precedent. A severe woman named Katerina, who served as Phelan's chief political strategist and initially looked at Helena like she was a particularly interesting insect. You genuinely think you can draft a treaty that will satisfy Draculeshti? Katerina asked on the second day of intensive work. I think we have to try, Helena said, because the alternative is Phelan binding himself to someone he doesn't love for the next several centuries, and I'm not okay with that. Katerina's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than her initial frost. The king inspires considerable loyalty. I'd begun to think only vampires felt it. He's easy to be loyal to, Helena said simply, and went back to drafting clause structures. The treaty took shape over 72 hours of brutal, intensive work. It created a framework of mutual obligations between House Jovanović and House Draculeshti that went far beyond a simple marriage alliance. Shared defense pacts with specific resource commitments. Trade agreements that intertwined their economic interests. A joint council with real authority to mediate disputes. Provisions for exchange programs between their courts to build cultural understanding and personal relationships. Penalties for betrayal that would cripple either house economically and politically. It's comprehensive enough that breaking it would be more costly than breaking a marriage bond, Mikhail said, reviewing the final draft, and the oversight mechanisms are actually stronger than what a marriage would provide. A bonded pair can hide dysfunction for centuries, but this treaty requires regular public accountability. Will Seraphine accept it? Helena asked. That's the question, Katerina said. She's young for a vampire, only a century and a half old, and ambitious. She wanted the prestige of marriage to the High King. This offers her house considerable power, but not the symbolic victory she might have hoped for. But it offers her personal freedom, Phelan said quietly. She's never struck me as particularly eager for the marriage itself, just for what it represents politically. If we can make the case that this treaty actually elevates her house more effectively than a marriage would, she might see the advantage. You'll need to present it perfectly, Katerina warned. Any hint of desperation or personal motivation, and the other houses will see it as weakness. It has to be framed as a superior alternative that you're offering from a position of strength. Leave the presentation to me, Phelan said. If Helena's treaty is as sound as I believe it is, I can make the political case. They worked through the final night before Phelan's departure. Helena polishing the language until every clause sang with precision, and Phelan rehearsing arguments with his advisors. It was nearly 4 in the morning when they finally had a version everyone agreed was ready. Katerina and Mikhail left to make preparations for the journey, leaving Phelan and Helena alone in her apartment for the first time in days. The space felt oddly empty without the constant presence of other vampires. "I don't know how to thank you for this," Phelan said quietly. "Even if it doesn't work, the fact that you tried—" "It's going to work," Helena interrupted. "It has to work, because you deserve better than a marriage of pure obligation. I'm a vampire king. Obligation is rather central to the position." "That doesn't mean you have to be miserable." Helena moved closer to him, suddenly aware that this might be the last time she saw him. Even if the treaty worked, he'd return to his world and she'd return to hers. The past 3 weeks had been an extraordinary aberration, not a sustainable reality. "Helena." Phelan said her name like a warning and a prayer. "If I had met you 300 years ago, everything would be different." "If you'd met me 300 years ago, I wouldn't have existed," Helena pointed out. "Wrong century, wrong continent, wrong everything." "Then I wish I'd met you 30 years from now after I'd found some way to step down from this position. Or 300 years in the future when perhaps the courts will have evolved past needing kings at all." He reached out, finally allowing himself to touch her face, his fingers cool against her cheek. "I wish for a timeline where I could ask you to dinner without it being a political complication and kiss you without risking everything I've built." Helena's breath caught. "You want to kiss me?" "I've wanted to kiss you since the 3rd evening when you laughed at my terrible joke about medieval scribal abbreviations," Phelan said. "But I'm a vampire king who's about to walk into the most politically delicate summit in a century, and you're a brilliant human who deserves someone without quite so much baggage. What if I don't care about the baggage? You should, and yet I don't." Helena made her own decision then, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. "You have to leave in 3 hours. For once in your very long life, can you just take something you want?" Phelan's control cracked. He kissed her like a man starving, like she was sunlight, and he'd decided to burn. Helena wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with equal intensity. 3 weeks of careful professional distance dissolving into this single moment of absolute honesty. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard while Helena was breathing hard. Phelan didn't technically need to breathe. He rested his forehead against hers. "Come with me," he said suddenly, "to the summit. I can bring a small retinue, and you're the translator of record for these documents. It would be completely appropriate to have you present." "Is that wise?" Helena asked, even as everything in her wanted to say yes. "Probably not. But I've been wise for 3 centuries, and it's exhausting. Come with me. Help me present this treaty. Stand beside me when I tell the assembled houses that there's a better way forward." "Okay," Helena said. "Yes, absolutely yes." Phelan kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. "We leave at 7. Pack for a week and bring formal clothes if you have them. Vampire summits tend toward the dramatic." Helena spent the next 2 hours in a whirlwind of packing and panic. She had exactly 1 formal dress, black, simple, purchased for academic conferences, and a handful of professional outfits that would have to suffice. She threw in her laptop and copies of all the translated documents, then stared at her reflection and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. The car that picked her up at 7 was absurdly luxurious, and Katerina was already inside reviewing documents on a tablet. "You're coming," Katerina observed neutrally. "Apparently, I make terrible decisions when sleep-deprived," Helena said. "Or very good ones." Katerina's expression remained unreadable. "The king is more focused and confident than I've seen him in decades. If your presence contributes to that, it serves our purposes." They drove to a private airfield where a jet waited, sleek and black and somehow perfectly appropriate for vampire royalty. Phelan was already aboard, and his face when he saw Helena walk up the stairs made the entire insane decision worthwhile. "You came," he said, as if he'd half expected her to reconsider. "I said I would." Helena settled into the obscenely comfortable seat beside him. "So where exactly are we going?" "Vienna," Phelan said. There's a castle beneath the city built in the 13th century, expanded over the years, now accessible only through certain tunnels and hidden entrances. It's neutral ground, maintained by a council of elder vampires who serve no particular house, the perfect location for a summit. The flight took 3 hours, during which Phelan walked Helena through the political landscape she was about to enter. House Draculesti, led by Seraphine and her mother Vladislava, controlled most of the Balkans and parts of Eastern Europe. House Corvinus held territory in Hungary and Romania and had been rivals with Draculesti for centuries. House Tepes, House Bathory, House Rakoczi, each name came with a history of alliances and betrayals going back centuries. And they all respect your authority? Helena asked. They respect the position of High King because the alternative is chaos, Phelan said. I was elected to the role by a council of houses after the last king's death, and I've maintained it by being scrupulously fair and occasionally ruthless when necessary. But the authority is always conditional. If enough houses united against me, I could be deposed. So presenting this treaty instead of marrying Seraphine is a risk. Everything at these summits is a risk, but I believe in what we've drafted, and I believe I can make the case for it. They arrived in Vienna at sunset, carefully planned timing, and were transported to the castle through a series of tunnels that seemed to run beneath half the city. The castle itself was breathtaking, all Gothic arches and stone halls lit by what Helena first thought were torches, but turned out to be very convincing electric lights. Modern conveniences hidden in historical aesthetics, Phelan explained. Vampires are traditional, but we're not actually medieval. We have internet access and climate control and all the usual amenities. Helena's rooms were in a tower overlooking an underground lake. Apparently, the castle complex was far more extensive than she'd realized, spreading through natural caverns beneath the city. Katerina had somehow arranged for formal gowns to be waiting in the wardrobe, all in styles that would be appropriate for vampire court. How did she know my size? Helena asked when Phelan came to escort her to the opening reception. Vampires are observant, Phelan said, and Katerina is particularly skilled at details. You look beautiful, by the way. The gown was deep green velvet, medieval in style, but fitted in a way that suggested modern tailoring. Helena felt absurdly out of place, and yet somehow exactly where she belonged, as Phelan offered his arm and led her into the reception hall. The assembled vampires were striking dozens of pale, elegant figures in formal wear that ranged from modern suits to elaborate historical dress. Conversations paused as Phelan entered, and Helena felt the weight of every gaze turning toward them. The High King arrives, someone announced formally, Phelan of House Jovanović and his guest. Phelan navigated the political waters with practiced ease, introducing Helena to various house leaders as his translator and advisor. Most were politely curious, a few were openly skeptical about the presence of a human, and then they reached Seraphine. She was stunning white hair cascading down her back in elaborate braids, her gown a deep crimson that should have clashed with her pale skin, but instead made her look like some Renaissance painting. Her eyes, pale gray, assessed Helena with sharp intelligence. So this is the translator we've heard so much about, Seraphine said, her voice carrying a faint Eastern European accent. The human who's been helping our dear High King with the marriage contracts? Among other legal documents, Helena said, refusing to be intimidated. The summit has required extensive preparation. Indeed it has. Seraphine's gaze shifted to Phelan. I look forward to your presentation tomorrow, Your Majesty. I understand you have some creative proposals to discuss. I believe I've found a path that will serve all our interests, Phelan said smoothly. I hope you'll consider it with an open mind. I always keep an open mind, Seraphine said. Though I confess, I'm curious what could possibly be superior to the marriage alliance our houses have been negotiating for the past year. The challenge in her voice was clear, and Helena felt a spike of anxiety. This was the moment Seraphine could dismiss the treaty proposal out of hand and insist on the marriage, and none of their work would matter. But Phelan simply inclined his head graciously. Tomorrow's session will, I hope, answer all questions. For tonight, let's simply enjoy the gathering. The reception continued for hours, a careful dance of political conversation and veiled negotiations. Helena found herself talking to various vampires about linguistics, history, and the peculiar challenges of translating ancient legal documents for modern use. More than one complimented her work, and several seemed genuinely intrigued by her presence. You're handling this remarkably well, Phelan murmured during a brief moment of relative privacy. Most humans would be terrified. I'm too busy being fascinated to be terrified, Helena admitted, though ask me again when I'm back in my room and have time to process that I'm at an underground vampire summit in Vienna. You can still leave, Phelan said quietly. I can have you on a plane home tonight if you're uncomfortable. I'm not leaving. Helena squeezed his hand briefly. We're seeing this through together. The formal presentation was scheduled for the next evening, giving Phelan a full day to conduct private negotiations with key house leaders. Helena spent the day reviewing the treaty one final time and trying not to panic. Katerina appeared mid-afternoon with tea and surprising reassurance. The preliminary conversations have gone better than expected, she said. Several houses are intrigued by the treaty approach. House Corvinus in particular sees advantages to a model that doesn't rely on marriage alliances. They have no suitable candidates for such bonds at present, and they're worried about being left out of future power structures. What about Seraphine? Vladislava, her mother, is the challenge. She's been planning this marriage for decades and sees it as the culmination of her house's ascension. Seraphine herself is harder to read. She plays her cards very close. The evening session was held in a grand hall that looked like something out of a medieval fantasy, all stone columns and vaulted ceilings. The house leaders sat in a semicircle, with Phelan at the center in a throne-like chair that Helena suspected he found ridiculous but accepted as part of the performance. She sat with the other advisors and translators close enough to see, but not part of the central negotiation. Phelan caught her eye once and offered a small, reassuring smile before his expression settled into regal authority. Houses of the Eternal Courts, he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. We gather to formalize the alliances that will guide our civilization for the next century. The marriage bond between House Jovanović and House Draculishti has been discussed extensively, and I wish to propose an alternative that I believe will serve our mutual interests more effectively. Murmurs rippled through the assembled vampires. Vladislava, seated in a position of honor with Seraphine beside her, went very still. Phelan continued, laying out the treaty structure with perfect political precision. He framed it not as a rejection of the marriage, but as an evolution of vampire diplomacy, a recognition that their civilization had grown too complex for individual marriage bonds to serve as the primary mechanism of alliance. The treaty he and Helena had drafted created networks of obligation and mutual benefit that could scale across multiple houses, not just two. The marriage bond serves a symbolic purpose, Phelan said, but symbolism without substance is hollow. This treaty provides substance-concrete commitments with enforcement mechanisms and accountability structures. It makes betrayal not just personally costly, but systematically impossible, and it does so while preserving the autonomy of both houses to make future alliances as circumstances require. He distributed copies of the full treaty beautifully printed and bound, another of Katerina's touches, and gave the assembled houses time to read through it. Helena watched their faces, trying to gauge reactions. Some looked intrigued, others skeptical. Vladislava's expression was cold fury barely contained. You present this as an evolution, Vladislava said when the reading period ended. I see it as an insult. House Draculeshti has negotiated in good faith for a marriage alliance, and now you offer us a piece of paper instead of a blood bond with the High King himself. I offer you something more valuable than a blood bond, Phelan said calmly. I offer you a genuine partnership built on mutual interest rather than personal obligation. Seraphine would be free to make her own alliances, to build her own power base without being defined by marriage to me, and House Draculishti gains concrete economic and defensive advantages that a marriage bond couldn't provide. You speak of my daughter's freedom as if she needs it, Vladislava snapped. She understands her duty to our house. Perhaps Seraphine should speak for herself, Phelan suggested mildly, and every eye in the hall turned to the young vampire. Seraphine stood with fluid grace, moving to the center of the hall. She looked at the treaty document in her hands, then at Phelan, then at her mother. When she spoke, her voice was clear and decisive. I have read the proposed treaty thoroughly. It is comprehensive, well-structured, and offers House Draculishti substantial advantages that a marriage alliance would not provide. The trade agreements alone would increase our economic power by an estimated 30% within a decade. The defensive pacts would make aggression against our territories essentially impossible without the aggressor facing the combined might of multiple houses. and the oversight mechanisms ensure that these commitments are enforceable, not merely symbolic. Seraphine, Vladislava began, but her daughter held up a hand. You raised me to think strategically, Mother, to value substance over symbolism. This treaty is strategic brilliance. It elevates our house while preserving my autonomy and binding House Jovanović to commitments they cannot easily break. Why would I reject that in favor of a marriage to someone I barely know? The silence in the hall was absolute. Helena held her breath, watching Vladislava's face cycle through fury to calculation to something that might have been reluctant pride. You believe this serves our house better, Vladislava said finally. I believe this positions House Draculesti as forward-thinking innovators rather than traditional power seekers, Seraphine said. And I believe the other houses will follow our lead, creating a new framework for vampire diplomacy that we help establish. That's worth more than the symbolic value of marrying the High King. It was political theater at its finest, and Helena realized with sudden certainty that Seraphine had been planning this. She'd read the treaty before this moment, had already decided it served her purposes, and was now using the public forum to reshape the narrative. She wasn't a jilted bride accepting a lesser offer, she was a visionary leader choosing a superior path. The question before the assembly, Phelan said, is whether this treaty satisfies the requirement for alliance between our houses. I invoke the principle of substitute satisfaction and ask for a good faith consideration of this alternative. The debate that followed was intense, with various House leaders weighing in on the precedent this would set and the political implications. But slowly, a consensus emerged, particularly when House Corvinus formally proposed extending similar treaty frameworks to other alliances, creating a new model of vampire diplomacy that didn't rely solely on marriage bonds. As dawn approached, carefully tracked by various vampires with an eye toward retreat to protected chambers, the vote was called. The treaty was accepted by a majority of houses, with House Draculesti voting in favor. The marriage alliance was formally dissolved, replaced by the comprehensive treaty that would bind the houses more effectively than any personal bond. Helena felt dizzy with relief and exhaustion as the assembly dispersed. Phelan found her in the crowd, his expression carefully neutral in public, but his eyes warm. You should rest, he said quietly. It's been a long night. For you too. When did you last feed? I'll manage. Go rest, Helena. We'll talk once I've handled the remaining formalities. She made her way back to her tower room as artificial dawn began to lighten the underground complex, clever lighting that reminded vampires to retreat to their chambers before actual sunrise. She fell into bed still wearing the formal gown, too exhausted to change. When she woke, it was evening again, and someone was knocking softly at her door. Helena stumbled up to find Seraphine standing in the hallway looking impossibly elegant in a simple black dress. May I come in? Seraphine asked. I wanted to speak with you privately. Helena stepped aside, suddenly very aware that she was rumpled and probably had pillow creases on her face. Of course. Can I offer you anything? Just a conversation. Seraphine settled into one of the chairs by the window, studying Helena with those pale gray eyes. You drafted the treaty, didn't you? Not Phelan. We worked on it together, Helena said carefully. But the core structure, the creative interpretation of substitute satisfaction, the comprehensive approach, that was you. I can see your fingerprints all over the linguistic precision. Seraphine smiled slightly. I was a scholar myself before I became heir to House Draculesti. I recognize academic thinking when I see it. I just wanted to help find an alternative, Helena admitted. Phelan deserved a choice. Phelan is the High King. He rarely gets choices. Seraphine's expression turned thoughtful. But you gave him one anyway, and in doing so, you gave me one as well. So I wanted to thank you. The treaty genuinely does serve my house better than the marriage would have. I get the political benefits without binding myself to someone I'd have to negotiate personal space with for centuries. You're very strategic, Helena said. I have to be. I'm young by vampire standards. I don't have centuries of accumulated power and influence to rely on. I have to be smarter and faster than the ancient houses if I want to matter. She paused. Do you love him? The question caught Helena off guard. We barely know each other. It's been 3 weeks. That's not an answer. Helena sat down in the opposite chair, twisting her hands together. I could love him. I'm already halfway there. But he's a vampire king who will live for centuries, and I'm a human translator who will be lucky to see 80. It's not exactly a practical foundation for a relationship. Vampires can turn humans, Seraphine pointed out, if both parties are willing. That's not a conversation we've had. Perhaps you should have it. Seraphine stood, moving toward the door. He's been alone for a very long time, Helena. Duty-bound and isolated in ways that would break most people. If you can give him something beyond that, even for a little while, it's worth more than you realize. She left before Helena could formulate a response, and Helena sat staring at the closed door, thinking about choices and time and what she actually wanted. The summit continued for 3 more days, various houses signing onto modified versions of the treaty framework, political alliances being negotiated and formalized, power structures subtly shifting. Helena attended some sessions as Phelan's translator, but mostly she explored the castle complex and tried to process everything that had happened. Phelan was busy constantly with negotiations and formal obligations, but he found moments to seek her out. They'd walk along the underground lake, talking about everything and nothing, or steal an hour in the library where Helena was delighted to discover texts she'd only read about in academic papers. "You're enjoying yourself," Phelan observed during one such library visit, watching her reverently handle a 14th century manuscript. "This is basically my fantasy," Helena admitted. "Ancient texts, castle libraries, conversations with people who actually lived through the history I study. If you'd told me a month ago that this is where I'd be, I'd have thought you were describing a dream." "And when you wake up?" Phelan asked quietly. "When the summit ends and you go back to your life, what then?" Helena set down the manuscript carefully. "Is that what you want? For me to go back to my normal life and pretend this never happened?" "I want you to have a choice," Phelan said. "The same choice you fought to give me. You don't owe me anything, Helena. You've already given me more than you know." "What if I want to stay?" The words hung in the air between them. Phelan went very still, his dark eyes searching her face. "You don't know what you're asking," he said finally. "My life is complicated in ways that would be difficult for a human to navigate long term. The politics alone would be exhausting, and you'd always be somewhat apart from vampire society, not quite one of us, not quite separate." "Unless I wasn't human," Helena said quietly. Phelan closed his eyes. "Don't make that choice lightly. Becoming a vampire means giving up sunlight forever. It means watching human friends and family age and die. It means existing in a world that can be beautiful, but also cruel and isolating. I wouldn't wish this on someone I care about." "What if I'm wishing it on myself?" Helena moved closer to him, taking his hand. "I'm not saying I've decided anything definitively, but I'm not ready to say goodbye either. Can we at least explore what this could be before deciding it's impossible?" "You're asking me to be selfish," Phelan said. "I'm asking you to let yourself want something. You've spent 3 centuries putting everyone else's needs first. Can you let yourself have this?" He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. "I don't want to hurt you." "Then don't. Just be with me. We'll figure out the rest as we go." The summit concluded successfully, with multiple houses adopting the treaty framework and various political tensions eased. Phelan was celebrated as a visionary leader, and Helena found herself the subject of considerable curiosity from various vampires interested in the human perspective that had shaped the new diplomatic approach. "You've made quite an impression," Katerina said on the final evening. "Several houses have asked if you'd be willing to consult on their own legal frameworks. Apparently, fresh eyes are valuable." "I have a job back home," Helena pointed out. "Yes, teaching undergraduates about medieval Hungarian at a state university where you're chronically underfunded and underappreciated," Katerina said bluntly. "I've done my research. What if I told you there's a position available as official translator and legal consultant to the High King's Court? It would pay considerably better and give you access to primary sources most scholars only dream about." Helena stared at her. "You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a choice. You can return to your previous life, or you can stay and build something new. The king would never ask it of you directly. He's too concerned with not influencing your decision, but I'm more practical. You're good for him, and you're genuinely skilled at work we need done. So yes, I'm offering you a job." "I need to think about it," Helena said. "Of course, but don't take too long. The king leaves for his primary residence in Prague tomorrow evening, and it would be convenient if you traveled with us." Helena spent that night walking the castle corridors, thinking about choices and consequences and what she actually wanted from her life. The academic career she'd built was respectable, but not particularly fulfilling. She loved the research, but felt stifled by institutional politics and budget constraints. The idea of working directly with primary sources, of shaping vampire diplomacy through linguistic precision, was intoxicating. And then there was Phelan. 3 weeks wasn't long to fall in love, but Helena had never been someone who made decisions based on timelines. She knew what she felt, and she knew what she wanted, even if the path forward was complicated. She found him in his chambers near dawn, handling last-minute correspondence before retreat to his day chambers. He looked up when she entered, setting aside his laptop. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Couldn't stop thinking." Helena closed the door behind her. "Katerina offered me a job, official translator to the High King's Court. She did that without consulting me," Phelan said carefully. "I didn't ask her to, Helena. I don't want you to feel pressured." "I know. She made that clear." Helena moved to sit beside him on the absurdly ornate couch. "I'm going to accept. Not because of her offer and not because I feel obligated, because I want to, because the work is fascinating and the opportunity is extraordinary, and because I'm not ready to walk away from you." Phelan cupped her face in his hands, his expression raw. "I will try very hard to make you happy. And if you decide at any point that this isn't working, that the complications outweigh the benefits, I will support whatever choice you make." "Same goes for you," Helena said. "If I become more trouble than I'm worth, impossible." He kissed her softly. "You're the least troublesome thing in my life, and that includes 3 centuries of vampire politics." They left for Prague the next evening. Helena's entire life packed into 3 suitcases and a commitment to forward her academic papers from her apartment. The castle in Prague was somehow even more impressive than the Vienna summit location, a sprawling complex that blended medieval architecture with modern comfort perched on a hill overlooking the city. "Home," Phelan said as they arrived, "or at least the closest thing I have to one. I maintain residences in several cities, but this is where I spend most of my time." Helena's rooms were in a tower with views over the city, connected to Phelan's chambers by a private corridor. It felt both intimate and respectful of boundaries, and she appreciated the careful thought that had gone into the arrangement. The work proved to be exactly what Katerina had promised: challenging, engaging, and endlessly fascinating. Helena spent her days translating historical documents, drafting modern legal language for vampire treaties, and consulting with various houses on diplomatic matters. She attended court sessions where Phelan mediated disputes and negotiated agreements, learning the intricate dance of vampire politics. And in the private moments between professional obligations, she and Phelan built something neither had expected to find. He showed her Prague at night, taking her to vampire establishments hidden in plain sight throughout the city. She introduced him to modern streaming services and made him watch historical dramas so she could laugh at his running commentary on inaccuracies. "No one actually dressed like that in 1645, he said during one particularly egregious costume drama, "and the politics are completely wrong. Charles I was many things, but he wasn't that naive about courtly intrigue." "You met Charles I?" "Briefly, in Oxford. Deeply unpleasant man, if we're being honest, though to be fair, he was having a terrible decade." It was the casual references to historical events he'd witnessed that sometimes stopped Helena in her tracks, reminding her of the fundamental difference between them. She was 32 years old with perhaps 50 years of active life ahead of her. Phelan was 345 and would likely live for centuries more. The question of turning, of becoming a vampire herself, hovered unspoken between them for weeks. Helena researched it carefully, reading accounts from vampires who'd been turned and humans who'd chosen to remain mortal despite relationships with vampires. The choice was permanent and profound, and she wasn't ready to make it lightly. It was Phelan who finally raised the subject directly, 3 months after Helena had moved to Prague. They were in his private library, Helena working on a translation while Phelan reviewed petitions from various houses. "You've been reading about turning," he said without preamble. "I've noticed the books you've been consulting." Helena set down her pen. "I've been trying to understand what it would mean. The accounts are pretty varied. Some people seem to adapt easily. Others struggle for decades." "It's different for everyone," Phelan said. "The physical transformation takes about a week, and it's unpleasant, but not unbearable. The psychological adjustment is harder. You mourn sunlight. You mourn the simple ability to move through the world without constant awareness of your nature. You mourn the passage of human time and the loss of mortal friends. Do you regret it? I regret the circumstances of my turning. It wasn't my choice. And I lost people I cared about in the siege that preceded it. But the existence itself? No. I've had 3 centuries to learn and grow and shape the world in small ways. I've seen wonders that would have been impossible in a mortal lifetime. Would you turn me if I asked? Phelan was quiet for a long moment. I would, but I need to be certain you were choosing it for the right reasons because you genuinely wanted the existence, not just because you wanted to stay with me. I've seen relationships fail spectacularly when one party turned purely for the other's sake and came to resent the sacrifice. That's fair. Helena turned to face him fully. I'm not ready to decide yet, but I needed to know it was possible, if I did choose it. It's possible, Phelan said, and I would be honored to be the one to turn you, if and when you make that choice. The conversation settled something between them, an acknowledgement that they were thinking long-term even if the specific shape of that future remained undefined. Helena threw herself into work and life with renewed energy, building friendships with various vampires in Phelan's court and finding her place in their strange, elegant world. She grew particularly close to Mikhail, who shared her love of ancient languages and proved to be an endless source of stories about Byzantine court politics. Katerina remained somewhat aloof, but showed her approval through small gestures, choosing Helena to accompany her to important negotiations, consulting her on sensitive diplomatic matters. And with Phelan, she built a relationship that felt solid despite its unusual foundation. He was attentive without being overwhelming, affectionate in private, while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries in public. They fell into comfortable routines, working side by side in the evenings, taking long walks through Prague's night streets, stealing moments of intimacy between the endless demands of his position. It was 6 months into her time in Prague when the crisis emerged. A dispute between House Corvinus and House Bathory escalated rapidly, threatening to shatter the fragile peace the summit had established. Accusations flew about broken treaty terms and violated boundaries, and both houses demanded Phelan's intervention. They're both wrong and both right, Phelan said tiredly, reviewing the documents late one evening. Corvinus violated the spirit of the agreement while technically adhering to the letter. Bathory responded disproportionately, but had legitimate grievance, and both are now so entrenched in their positions that any ruling I make will alienate someone. Helena read through the treaty language carefully, her translator's eye catching something the political analysts had missed. What if you don't rule at all? Look at this clause here. It establishes a mediation process for disputes that both parties must attempt before escalation to your authority. Did they go through mediation? They claim they did, but the documentation is suspiciously sparse. Phelan leaned over her shoulder, reading the clause. You're thinking we invoke the procedural requirement and force them back to mediation? With a neutral mediator they both respect, someone skilled at finding compromise solutions. Helena looked up at him. What about Seraphine? She's young enough not to have deep-rooted allegiances to either house, but respected enough that they'd accept her authority, and we know she's brilliant at political strategy. That's actually inspired. Phelan pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Seraphine owes me a favor from the summit, and this would give her house considerable prestige. If she successfully mediates this dispute, it positions House Draculesti as the go-to neutral party for future conflicts. The solution worked beautifully. Seraphine agreed immediately and conducted the mediation with skill that impressed even Katerina. The dispute was resolved within 2 weeks, with both houses satisfied and a precedent established for handling future conflicts without requiring the High King's direct intervention. You're getting dangerously good at this, Phelan told Helena afterward. Several house leaders have commented on how much more effective my court has become since you arrived. I'm just applying basic problem-solving skills, Helena said. Though I admit it's more satisfying when the problems involve centuries-old vampire feuds rather than university department politics. You found your calling. Phelan pulled her close, kissing her temple. I'm glad you stayed. Me too. The months blurred into a year, then longer. Helena settled into vampire society with surprising ease, her academic background and diplomatic skills making her valuable to multiple houses. She maintained her humanity. Phelan ensured she had access to daylight spaces and human company when needed, but found herself increasingly comfortable in the nocturnal world. It was 18 months after the Vienna summit when Helena finally made her decision about turning. She woke one evening in her tower rooms watching the sunset through her window and realized she was ready. Not because she was afraid of aging or desperate to stay with Phelan, but because she genuinely wanted the existence he'd described. The opportunity to spend centuries learning and growing, to see history unfold firsthand, to build something lasting in the world. She found Phelan in his study, working through correspondence as usual. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him set aside his work immediately. "I want to turn," Helena said without preamble. "Not tonight, necessarily, but soon. I'm ready." Phelan crossed to her in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. "You're certain? This isn't something you can undo." "I'm certain. I've thought about it carefully, and I want this. The existence, the work, the future, all of it. Then we'll do it properly." Phelan's voice was gentle but serious. "There are preparations required. You'll need to arrange your human affairs. Say whatever goodbyes are necessary. The transformation itself should happen in a secure location with support readily available. And afterward, you'll need time to adjust before resuming work." "How long does all that take?" "A month for preparations, a week for the transformation itself, several weeks for adjustment. Call it 3 months total before you'd be ready to return to your current responsibilities." Helena nodded, already mentally organizing what she'd need to do. Her parents were both gone, and she drifted from most of her university colleagues. There were a few friends who deserved proper goodbyes, though the explanations would be complicated. "I can be ready in a month." "Then in a month," Phelan agreed and kissed her with a tenderness that made her chest ache. The month passed in a blur of preparations. Helena settled her human affairs, transferring her apartment lease, closing bank accounts, having awkward conversations with the few friends she'd maintained contact with about taking an extended research position abroad. Katerina handled the logistics of the transformation itself, preparing a secure chamber in the castle's deepest levels where Helena would be safe during the vulnerable transition period. Phelan was attentive but distant in the final days, and Helena finally confronted him about it the evening before the transformation. "You're avoiding me," she said bluntly. "I'm giving you space to reconsider without pressure," Phelan said. "I don't need space. I need you to stop treating this like you're doing something terrible to me." Helena moved closer, taking his face in her hands. "This is my choice, made freely and with full understanding. I want this existence, and I want it with you. Stop feeling guilty." "I've turned people before," Phelan said quietly. "Soldiers during wars, scholars I thought deserved longer to pursue their work. Most of them adapted well, but some struggled. One grew to hate me for it, blame me for stealing his mortal life. I can't bear the thought of you looking at me like that centuries from now." "Then look at me now," Helena said firmly. "I love you. I love this life we've built. I want centuries to explore it further. You're not stealing anything. You're giving me a gift I'm choosing to accept." He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and they spent the night together in a tangle of emotion and physical connection that felt like both ending and beginning. The transformation itself was brutal but bearable. Phelan's blood entering her system burned like ice and fire simultaneously, and Helena felt her human body dying incrementally over the following week. She was aware of Phelan's constant presence, his voice talking her through the stages, his hand steady when fever and pain made her want to scream. And then, on the 7th evening, she woke to a world transformed. Colors were sharper, sounds carried impossible detail, and scents painted 3-dimensional pictures in her mind. She could hear heartbeats from 3 floors away and feel the minute vibrations of movement through stone. "Easy," Phelan said, appearing beside her instantly. "The sensory input is overwhelming at first. Focus on my voice and let everything else settle into background." Helena did as instructed, gradually learning to filter the flood of information. When she finally felt stable enough to stand, Phelan handed her a mirror. The woman looking back was recognizable but transformed. Her skin had taken on the characteristic pale luminescence of vampires, and her eyes held a new depth and clarity. Her hair seemed darker against her changed complexion, and her features had sharpened slightly, becoming more defined. "I look like I belong," Helena said wonderingly. "You do belong," Phelan said. "You have for a while now. This just makes it official." The adjustment period was challenging, learning to feed without causing harm. developing the control necessary to exist around humans safely, understanding the new political implications of her position as the High King's partner and a newly turned vampire. But Helena approached it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, and within weeks, she'd adapted enough to resume limited work. The other houses responded to her transformation with mixed reactions. Some saw it as confirmation of her commitment to vampire society and treated her with new respect. Others viewed it as the High King showing favoritism to a human turned vampire and grumbled about precedent. But Seraphine, who visited a month after the transformation, was unequivocally supportive. "You look well," Seraphine said, examining Helena critically. "The transformation suited you. Some people look wrong as vampires, but you've taken to it naturally." "I feel more myself than I ever did as a human," Helena admitted. "Is that strange?" "Not at all. Some people are meant for this existence. You're clearly one of them." Seraphine settled into a chair in Helena's receiving room. "I also came to tell you that there's a faction forming younger vampires mostly, those turned in the last 2 centuries who want to reform some of our more archaic practices. They're looking for someone to help draft new frameworks for things like territory disputes and resource allocation. Your name came up repeatedly." "My name?" Helena was surprised. "I'm barely a month old as a vampire." "But you have decades of human scholarship and modern legal training that most of us lack, and you've already proven you can navigate vampire politics successfully. The reform faction wants fresh perspectives. Wide, and you're uniquely positioned to provide them." It was the beginning of what would become Helena's primary work, serving as a bridge between vampire tradition and modern governance, drafting frameworks that preserved what worked while updating what didn't. She worked closely with Phelan on some projects and independently on others, carving out her own sphere of influence within vampire society. Their relationship deepened and settled into something that felt permanent, despite the enormous timescale they now shared. Phelan was no longer the isolated king bearing his responsibilities alone. He had a true partner who understood both his work and the weight of his position. And Helena had found a purpose that engaged every part of her mind and would challenge her for centuries to come. It was 2 years after her transformation when Phelan took her back to Vienna for an anniversary celebration of the summit that had changed everything. The castle was as impressive as Helena remembered, and many of the same vampires were present, though the atmosphere was celebratory rather than tense. They attended the formal reception, made diplomatic small talk with various houses, and generally fulfilled their official obligations. But as the evening wound down and other vampires began to drift away, Phelan took Helena's hand and led her toward a quiet corridor. "I want to show you something," he said, guiding her through familiar passages to a section of the castle she hadn't explored before. They emerged onto a balcony overlooking the underground lake, the artificial lighting creating something that almost looked like moonlight on water. Phelan wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "This was where I came after every previous summit," Phelan said quietly, "to remind myself why the work mattered, why maintaining the peace was worth the personal cost. I'd stand here and think about all the vampires whose lives depended on the decisions made in those halls, and I'd recommit to another century of service." "And now?" Helena asked. "Now I stand here and think about how lucky I am." He turned her to face him, his expression open and warm. "I thought I'd spend eternity alone at the top, making necessary decisions and bearing necessary burdens. But then you walked into my life with your medieval Hungarian expertise and your refusal to accept impossible situations, and everything changed. You gave me a new life," Helena said. "Literally and figuratively. I should be thanking you." "Then let's call it even." Phelan smiled, that rare, full smile that still made Helena's heart skip. "Partners in all things, for as long as we both want this." "That's going to be a very long time," Helena promised and kissed him as the artificial stars glittered overhead. They had centuries ahead of them, challenges to face, work to accomplish, a world to navigate together. But in that moment, standing on a balcony in a castle beneath Vienna, time felt both infinite and perfectly captured in the space between heartbeats. Helena thought about that evening 2 years ago when she'd first met Phelan, when she'd agreed to translate contracts without understanding what she was stepping into. If someone had told her then where she'd end up, she'd have thought they were describing fantasy. But fantasy had become reality, and reality was better than anything she could have imagined. She had work that challenged her, a partner who valued her, and an existence that stretched gloriously into an open future. It was exactly 1 week later when the moment happened that would define everything. They were back in Prague, and Helena had been working late on a particularly complex treaty revision. Phelan had been in court sessions most of the evening, handling some territorial dispute between minor houses, and Helena had lost track of time entirely. She looked up from her documents to find Phelan standing in the doorway of her study, still in his formal court attire, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Is the session done?" she asked, stretching to ease cramped muscles. "An hour ago." Phelan moved into the room, and Helena realized with a start that the windows were showing the first hints of pre-dawn light, the artificial warning system that reminded vampires to seek shelter before actual sunrise. "Oh God, I completely lost track." Helena stood quickly, already moving toward the interior chambers where they'd be safe from daylight. "We need to... wait." Phelan caught her hand, stopping her. "Come here for a moment." Helena let him pull her close, confused by his almost dreamy expression. "Phelan, it's nearly dawn. We need to get to the interior rooms." "I know." He cupped her face in his hands, looking at her like he was memorizing every detail. "But I just spent 3 hours listening to vampires argue about boundary lines that have been disputed for 2 centuries, and all I could think about was getting back to you. And then I walk in, and you're completely absorbed in making sure treaty language is precise enough that it won't be misinterpreted 50 years from now, and you're beautiful and brilliant and mine, and I just need you to know that I love you." "I love you too," Helena said, warmth flooding through her. "But I'll love you just as much in the interior chambers where we won't burn to death in 10 minutes. 10 minutes is an eternity for a vampire," Phelan said and kissed her. Helena melted into it, losing herself in the familiar taste and feel of him. Her hands found their way into his hair, pulling him closer, and he backed her against the doorframe of her study, deepening the kiss until she forgot about dawn and time and everything except this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unnecessarily but heavily, the windows were showing dangerous levels of light. "Okay, now we really need to move," Helena said, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the interior corridor. They ran together through the castle passages, laughing breathlessly despite the urgency. The protective shutters were already deploying automatically throughout the building, blocking out the deadly sunrise, but they'd cut it dangerously close. They tumbled into Phelan's chambers just as the final shutters sealed, leaving them in the comfortable darkness of vampire safe spaces. Helena leaned against the closed door, her unnecessary breathing gradually slowing, and looked at Phelan. He was grinning like an idiot, his usual regal composure completely abandoned. "We almost just burned to death," Helena pointed out. "I know." Phelan crossed to her, crowding her against the door. "And I'd do it again for another minute of kissing you in that doorway. I'd face 100 sunrises if it meant staying with you." The words hit Helena with unexpected force, the echo of what this moment was, what they had almost sacrificed without thinking. Phelan would have gladly faced the sunrise rather than let go of her, and she'd have stood there with him, time forgotten, wrapped up in each other. "You're ridiculous," she said, but she was smiling. "A vampire king who nearly gets himself killed because he can't stop kissing his girlfriend." "Partner," Phelan corrected. "You're not my girlfriend. You're my partner in everything that matters. And yes, I'm ridiculous about you. I've been ridiculous about you since you argued with me about verb conjugations in medieval Hungarian." Helena pulled him into another kiss, softer this time, but no less intense. "Good, because I'm ridiculous about you too. Ridiculous enough to turn vampire, to give up sunlight forever, to spend eternity helping you navigate impossible political situations. We should probably work on our time management," Phelan said eventually. "Katerina would never let me hear the end of it if we actually got ourselves killed via sunrise because we were too busy kissing." "Agreed. New rule, no doorway kisses within 30 minutes of dawn. Terrible rule, counter proposal, doorway kisses at any time, but we set multiple alarms. You're supposed to be a wise ancient king. I'm supposed to be a lot of things. With you, I get to just be myself." They spent the day in comfortable companionship, Phelan catching up on correspondence while Helena read through new treaty proposals, occasionally pausing to exchange thoughts or just exist in the same space. It was domestic and peaceful and exactly what Helena had hoped for when she'd made the choice to stay. As the next evening approached and the shutters began to retract, letting in the safe darkness, Helena found Phelan on the balcony of his chambers, looking out over Prague's glittering lights. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, joining him. "Thinking about how much has changed in 2 years," Phelan said. "When I went to Vienna for that summit, I was prepared to bind myself to someone I barely knew because it was necessary. I had accepted it as the cost of keeping the peace. And instead, you got stuck with me. Instead, I got lucky beyond any measure I'd dared hope for." He pulled her against his side, his arm secure around her waist. "You gave me a choice when I thought I had none. You taught me that duty and happiness don't have to be mutually exclusive. You made me remember what it feels like to want something just for myself. You gave me just as much," Helena said. "A purpose, a home, an existence I never could have found in the human world. We saved each other, I think." "Then let's keep doing that," Phelan said, "for the next century and the one after that and however many more were granted." "Deal," Helena agreed, and they stood together watching the city lights. Two immortals who'd found something rare and precious, a love that made even eternity feel too short. The work continued, treaties to draft, disputes to mediate, the endless, intricate dance of vampire politics. But through all of it, Helena and Phelan had each other. Partners in every sense that mattered. They built something lasting, not just in their relationship, but in the structures they created for vampire society, frameworks that would serve for generations. Katerina eventually stopped looking vaguely suspicious of Helena and started actively collaborating with her on diplomatic initiatives. Mikhail became a genuine friend, teaching Helena ancient languages she'd never encountered and regaling her with stories from millennia of existence. Seraphine visited regularly, and the three of them, young vampires by the standards of the oldest houses, formed a kind of informal alliance that pushed for continued reform and modernization. And sometimes, late in the evening when work was done and the castle was quiet, Phelan would find Helena wherever she was working and pull her into a kiss that made her forget time entirely. They were more careful about Dawn after that first near disaster, but the intensity never faded the knowledge that they'd both found something worth any risk, worth any sacrifice. On their 5th anniversary, measured from that first evening when Helena had opened her door to a strange diplomatic client, they returned to her old apartment building in the city where they'd met. The building was the same, though Helena's unit had long since been rented to someone else. They stood in the hallway outside what had been her door, and Phelan smiled. "This is where it started," he said. "Where I walked into your life, planning to use your skills for a few weeks and then disappear back into my world. And instead, you kept coming back," Helena said, "every evening at 8:30 until those evenings became the best part of my day." "They were the best part of mine, too. The only time I got to be just Phelan the scholar instead of Phelan the king, at least until you figured out what I was and decided you didn't care about the impossibility of it all. Some impossibilities are worth pursuing." Helena rose on her toes to kiss him, there in the doorway where so much had begun. This one certainly was. They had forever ahead of them, literally, barring disaster, centuries to work and love and build something meaningful. But standing in that doorway, kissing like they had all the time in the world, because they actually did, Helena thought about that moment weeks ago when they'd nearly burned rather than let go of each other. Time was both infinite and precious. They'd spent it well so far, and they'd continue to spend it well together. Partners, bound not by magic or political necessity, but by choice freely made and continuously renewed. The sun would rise and set thousands more times, but Helena and Phelan would face each night together, finding joy in the work and in each other, building a future that honored the past while creating something entirely new. It was exactly what Helena had wanted when she'd decided to stay, when she'd chosen transformation, when she'd stood in a different doorway and forgotten time because the moment was too perfect to abandon. And it was everything Phelan had stopped letting himself hope for centuries ago, a true partnership. Someone who saw both the king and the man beneath and loved them equally. A reason to face eternity with anticipation instead of resignation. They walked out of the building hand in hand into the Prague night that would never hold danger for them, and back to the castle that had become home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to shape their world. But tonight was theirs, stolen from time's relentless march, perfect in its simplicity. In the centuries to come, They'd face conflicts and crises, joy and sorrow, the endless turning of history that vampires witnessed from their immortal perspective. But they'd face it together, bound by something stronger than any blood magic love freely given and gratefully received, growing deeper with each passing year. And sometimes, late in the evening when the world was quiet, they'd find themselves in a doorway somewhere, kissing and forgetting time entirely, knowing that they'd both gladly face 1,000 sunrises if it meant one more moment together. But they never had to make that choice. They had eternity instead, and they spent it well.